And it's Friday again, Tim. Here we are looking at project management principles as they relate to how we as project managers deal with people.
And that sounds wonderful. Good day, Merv. So, what do you want
So,
to talk about today?
well, I thought I was trying to think of what we did last week, and did we not, or 2 weeks ago, did we not look at something about building shared understanding based on the fact that we've already been talking about collaboration and those sorts of things, just kind of extending that discussion?
It is extending it. It's another facet of working with groups of people where collaboration is working together and contributing through voting and sharing of ideas. We're building a shared understanding has that more specific focus of saying, let's get to agreement and let's use something called consensus. And I thought this would be a really good topic for us to explore.
So I like it. In fact, why don't I begin with something that happened in my experience, not so much with shared understanding as what happened with a misunderstanding. How's that?
That's perfect.
And then we can build on that. I was working on a large project in the old waterfall methodology. So we were doing our requirements definition. And so, as you know, from waterfall requirements, then you do design, then you do development, then you do testing. So there's a huge gap between requirements and testing.
Right.
So we develop our requirements. As I was supporting the user group, we signed off on the requirements. The only thing I didn't like about those requirements is they were written in more of an English narrative as opposed to, say, a structured English, which is more defined. But nonetheless, we signed off because we understood, based on discussion and based on the written word, what was required. When we got to testing, the exact opposite of what we had required for that requirement was what appeared in our test cases. And we sat there, scratched our head and said, how could the system integrator get it so wrong? I'm looking at the document. My user group is looking at the document. It's spelled out perfectly. We're looking at the test results and they're exactly the opposite. And so we got the system integrator in the room and we began to converse about how they could have gotten things exactly wrong. And when they explained themselves, and I went and reread it based on their explanation, the exact same words that were written for our understanding were written in such a way that the SI, the system integrator, understood them exactly opposite. I wish I had kept that document because I sat there and scratched my head and said, how on earth could we have two totally, completely different explanations of the written word? And yet we did, and both were valid. So that was a huge learning curve for me in terms of misunderstandings created even from the written word if we're not very careful as to how to put those down on paper.
Even effective oral and written communication can create misunderstandings. Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me. Uh, you
We
know,
laughed
I
at that. We laughed at that for several months afterwards.
yeah, it's a great learning. But again, you wonder why, you talk to a lot of project managers who've had 30 and 40 years experience, and they're so slow in saying, now, let me get this straight. What are you telling me? Are
Yeah.
you telling me this or this? Or are you telling me this and this and this? Or are you telling me this and this and not this? What are we saying here? And it's frustrating for a lot of people working with very experienced teams and managers to go through this very painful process.
Well, and what was really um, kind of frustrating, although laughable afterwards, was the fact that we had discussed it orally and had believed that we came to an understanding. So then when it was documented in writing and we both looked at it, we believed we understood what was there. And yet the exact opposite happened. So yeah, misunderstandings, communications are so important. And maybe that's where we should go in terms of this whole idea, how to avoid misunderstandings, how to come to a common understanding, and how it is that we build shared understanding.
So PMI uses some very wild words, some very interesting words in actually exploring what you were talking about in building this shared understanding. They say identify root causes of misunderstandings. We discussed that.
Yep.
Survey all necessary parties to reach consensus. There's consensus, and support outcome of parties' agreement and investigate potential misunderstandings. The two words I want to explore right now are consensus and agreement. What do you see as the difference between those two?
Well, agreement to me is that you've settled exactly on what it is that both parties are amenable to. Consensus says to me that I don't necessarily support the that I don't necessarily agree with the final conclusion, but I will support it because as a team, we're moving forward. Just because I have this opinion or this understanding doesn't mean my opinion or understanding has to be the correct one in every situation. So to me, consensus is supporting what the larger body wants to go forward with and then just not getting in the way of that. I mean, the worst thing you can do is come to some sort of shared understanding in a team. And then just because you don't agree, then you sit there for the next several weeks harping at what was agreed to that you can't support.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. Where agreement means both you and I have the same idea. And consensus says we don't have to do that, but we can work together to whatever the greater group agrees. Now, this is troublesome because this requires that the people who don't agree make some type of a sacrifice, whether it's emotional, like your ego, or whether it's conceptual or functional sacrifice. Stepping back and allowing other people to have an idea that's that you think is not as good, but still supporting the group. That takes a little bit of will.
It does, but it also takes teamwork. And I think what you're always doing as part of that team is you're supporting the team. And let me take a completely different example just to kind of support what I just said. Years ago, I played hockey back in my younger days when I could actually muster up enough wind to chase after a puck. But we were in the final game of the playoffs. We were in the last 2 minutes, and we had for people who understand the game of hockey, we had a man advantage because of a penalty situation. And my line was out there. We had about 2 minutes. And I thought to myself, there is someone on the bench who skates and is better in these situations than I am. So I benched myself in favor of this other teammate. And within that 2 minutes, that person scored the winning goal. So from a consensus point of view, is it my willing? Did I really want to be off the ice or did I want to be the hero and score that goal? Yes. But more importantly, I thought someone could have done it better and it proved to be true. So that's kind of my team sport analogy to what what you had just been talking about.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And it's looking at the results. Now, if you go into economics, there's this whole class of economics called justice, and it recognizes the sacrifice that you make in order to create that consensus. I'm willing to set aside what is not talked about, and I'm talking about in current literature as well as economics and philosophy. Um, in order to sacrifice, you have to give up something, right? And you have to think, I'm releasing something that I really want. But the beautiful thing of this, and this is a natural process. If we do this enough, we realize that the group returns something of greater value. And for you, it was that winning goal. And even though you didn't act on that goal, your actions set up that success. So you were able to actually feel and contribute to the success of the game, even though you were inactive.
Yeah, think about that. Taking yourself out of the game to make the game more successful.
You know,
That's
but
kind of
but that makes sense.
it does. Yeah.
Again, What are the obstacles I'm creating? There's a wonderful book written about leadership and management, where the CEO at the end of the book says, you know what? I'm the problem here. I'm the roadblock. I'm going to move into a less important position for the corporation to thrive. We don't have that a lot currently. We don't see that in our culture currently. But,
Right.
think about what would happen in companies if they were able to have that type of a mindset. Again, we that's not what we do for our CEOs. We pay our CEOs hundreds of times more than any individual worker. So this is a whole cultural norm that we don't see in our working environment.
No, that's exactly right. And the thing that I am so used to, and you are too, as part of an industry which can only develop based on teams. You can only develop a product based on team effort. And so if you understand the value of team, then those decisions are made much easier. It's when someone decides to get their ego in the way and beat their chest and want to become the hero. That's typically where the team runs into problems. You either lose support from the other team members, or the person is so obtrusive in the way that they want their ideas put forth that no one else wants to challenge them, that you end up with a lesser product. So, yeah, to me, I think you and I have been privileged to be part of an industry that depends on teamwork, and moving forward as teams.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And it served me well. The
Yeah.
beautiful thing is the same philosophy and the same mechanisms that work inside of a project environment work in any group. This goes beyond project management into general human behavior. So
Yes.
this makes us powerhouses in great forces of nature in any type of group activity.
And I was thinking of the question you posed earlier, because we started off a little bit of talking about a common or shared understanding. And then we talked about the difference between agreement and consensus. I would venture to say that there's even a slight nuance with the term shared understanding. And that is, let me give an example, something that I've just been through recently. We had a scope issue. The system integrator believed an feature was out of scope. The client believed the feature was in scope. When the system integrator e- explained that whether it was in scope or out of scope, it was going to take the schedule out past what was tolerable. Suddenly, the client came to that same shared understanding that the timeline at this point was more important than putting that feature in. So, although there was disagreement, there was not consensus, there was a shared understanding of what was better for the project. So, I think that's a slight nuance, even on what we're talking about.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from with that. Fascinating. So here we go. Here we go. We start off with a blank slate on every project. We end up with everybody supporting the group and the group making the decisions. And so you have the directions going there, and you have the project managers and advisor and facilitator along the way. Now, how do you, number one, create that consensus? Number two, how do you maintain that consensus? Let's start with create. How do you formally and actively create an environment that says we're going to agree as a group?
That's interesting, because every project begins with two groups who don't know each other. And so it becomes very important. The IT, well, typically in my world, I suppose if you're part of an IT group that's within an organization and has dealt with your clients over the years, then yes, you do know each other. But coming at it from a system integrator, walking into a client situation, having now earned the right to develop a project or develop a system for them, you don't really know each other. And so you have to develop that consensus. So typically up front, I would vote for developing something in a more formal fashion. And that is that we would put out, for example, our opinions or our requirements for the groups to look at. Number number two, or maybe number one in my case, as a system integrator, as a project manager, I have learned to listen, but to listen effectively. That means I have to learn to shut up so that I can really take in what my client wants to do. And then from there, we go into a discussion of the ideas. We go into a discussion of differences that we may have until we come to that agreement on how we're going to move forward. So initially, I do some sort of formal process. I don't know if that fits with your experience or how you conduct your teams.
Yeah, actually. And here's the weird thing. I even take it at a higher, more general approach. I see every project as us and them. Here's why. Them has the problem. Us has a solution. And us plus them provides a solution to the problem. Now, you and I know that us versus them sets it up for a win-lose solution, right? Because when you have
Right.
us versus them, somebody has to win. And in order for somebody to win, somebody has to win. And so what we need to do is provide some mechanics, some tools and techniques, and some formal process that says, let's pull this us and them into a we. And we have project documents like the team charter. We have ceremonies like the kickoff. And we have these opportunities. And this is what a project manager is supposed to create that culture that, number one, we repeat the framework of that culture by repeating the team charter, but we also um, we assess and we measure. Is the team working well? Is the team growing as a team in its progress? And are we all saying the same thing? Are we all working toward the same objective? Yeah, you and I may use different words, but we see it exactly the same way.
Well, and I think formalizing through the team charters is very important. But as I heard you, I think you answered the second question as well. How do I keep that consensus going? And I think what you said, you keep on monitoring and assessing. And so you keep going back, not necessarily to the document, because that's kind of, you know, reading the contract almost, but it's kind of going back and checking. Am I doing it correctly? Is my client still assessing these situations correctly? Are we still in consensus, even if we're not always in agreement on every single requirement?
Very good. Yes, I'm right there with you. And this is something that we do. It's just like a garden. If you're in the middle of July, even if it's monsoon season like we have in the Southwest, you still keep an eye on the water and you still make sure that the vegetables are not drying on the vine, but they're thriving, because you're going to want them in 5 or 6 weeks. So you don't stop in the middle of a project, just saying, okay, we're done with that phase.
Yeah.
We're not talking about phases here. We're talking about behavior that lasts the entire project.
And I will add one more thing to the formality of that consensus gathering and an ongoing assessment. I still do trust my gut. I still, when I am in situations, I second guess myself. I look for motives behind the motives, or as one book told me, seek for the question behind the question. So I'm always doing that kind of gut check as well as the formality. And I tell you what, after years of experience, gut checking works.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but the people who don't pass the PMP exam, they have one common statement. I didn't trust myself. I knew what the answer was
Interesting.
and I changed it. And they say, I know I got that question wrong because I changed it. And it's funny. If you do something long enough, there's something called habit or muscle memory. And when you start questioning that habit or muscle memory, that's when you start locking up.
Oh, absolutely. And so there is as you were saying, muscle memory or whatever. There becomes almost an innateness in what it is that we do as project managers. We can
Yeah.
assess and we can size up a situation much quicker than when we were younger in our careers and didn't understand all of the perhaps the people factors or the human factors that go into the different decisions and different meeting cadences and those sorts of things that happen on projects.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Let's take a turn into another area of understandings. Let's go into their opposite.
Yeah,
Let's look about misunderstandings. Okay. So how much of your time do you spend consciously looking for and removing misunderstandings? Or is it just something that you do, just like, taking a breath while you're swimming laps?
I think now it's more like that, like you just described. And probably the best answer to that is a lot less time than when I first became a project manager. The anomaly, that neat little story that I told at the beginning where we read the same words and had direct opposite meanings, that doesn't happen very often anymore. That was an anomaly even in that situation. So what I find in terms of addressing misunderstandings, because I think because I've developed that second or that sixth sense or whatever, in terms of what could cause a misunderstanding, I'm not chasing as many of those because I don't allow for the opportunity for as many of those to arise. I
I
imagine it's the same for you.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. I after creating so much content, after writing so many articles, after doing so many PowerPoint presentations, after doing so much reading over these decades, I can tell when people do not understand what they're trying to describe. They
Yes.
they they basically talk around a concept, but there's something about me that says, "Wait, we need clarification here. There's something that's not clear." And so this is what I'm looking at, and it's a lot of pattern recognition in the actions and the results, and also pattern recognition in the communication, whether it's oral or verbal. You can tell when somebody's tap dancing because they're it's not that they're saying too much information, they're saying too much words.
Well, and I think you hit it right on the head. And that is, think of pattern recognition in terms of the infinite ways that we as human beings can react to a situation. And yet we can discern, sixth sense wise, we can discern a pattern that at least gets our antenna up, that starts watching for those um, opportunities for misunderstanding.
You know,
And-
I'm violently in agreement with you. I really think that one of the humanity's superpowers is patternicity, the ability to discern patterns in a quick, efficient manner. In the jungle, if we're in the jungle, we notice really quickly in our peripheral vision a subtle change in shadow and light. And it's like, whoops, what's going on here? And that's what kept us alive.
yeah.
And when we actually get into this knowledge working and this tool working that we've been doing for the last 200 years, we don't need the shadow and light, but we can use that same set of tools in looking at the knowledge and information behavior of people. And, I think we're getting close to that sixth sense that you're using.
Well, and the other thing I was just thinking as you were speaking about that is we're speaking as two old guys. I'm using that as a euphemism, but they're two very experienced project managers. So if I'm a young project manager, am I about to become a little disillusioned because I haven't got that sixth sense because I'm not as aged as you two guys are? Or how is it that I, as a young project manager, can begin to develop those pattern recognitions and sixth sense so that I can become more effective at seeing misunderstandings develop even as they develop? Is there,
Boy, what? Let's hear you. I have an answer. I have an answer for this, but why don't you tell me how you would advise a mentee in
I,
developing that recognition?
Mine is, it's something that I've done. I'm a people watcher. I observe. I see what's effective. I see what's not effective. And some of that I gained just by watching people in airports, for example, in terms of what's effective and how they got their way and how they didn't get their way on projects, in meetings. Sometimes I sit back and shut up and just watch what's going on and seeing what worked and what didn't work. And then take mental notes, sometimes even physical notes in terms of, aha, this is something I'm going to work on for my next 3 or 4 weeks. So to me, I'm a people watcher and I'm an observer of human nature. And that's how I learned to become exactly what we're talking about right now.
I remember exactly when I started cluing in on what you just said. I was 9 years old and I spent 3 summers with my grandparents about 300 miles away from my house, right? And my grandfather at that time was working with both the state and the federal Congress on certain things. And they would take me out to lunch. When he had a break from his work, they'd take me out to a lunch and we'd go to a park or we'd go to a shopping center. And both my grandfather and grandmother would say, we just love to watch people. And
Oh.
they would actually have competitions to figure out, when a mom and kids were going through a mall, which was the first old person that would get frustrated. And my grandfather taking me down to the state capitol would say, okay, we're going to go into the Senate pre-chambers here. And there's these 25 guys I'm going to introduce you to. And I'm going to talk to this one guy. And here's what I'm willing to bet. I'm going to say exactly this to him, and he's going to say exactly this to me back. Watch.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. It was amazing to see. And it's like, it's I thought he was a magician, but he wasn't. It was just he did it so much. So what we're looking at is, if you want to start looking at miscommunication and misunderstanding, don't just use your projects, use everything. And there's something else I want to add to this too. I was talking to my class today about this. One of the most important skills that we can have as a project manager is turning data to information and information to reports. And if you can quantify that data and quantify the analysis required to turn that data into the proper information, and then lay out that information in a meaningful way, you can basically create a tool that actually helps you keep track of stuff and alerts you to things that are going wrong. Or you can actually build it as a habit yourself and say, there's something wrong here. Let me go back from the report to the information. Let me go to the information to the data and let me validate. And all of a sudden, we're getting back to 6,000 years ago, the way the Greeks and the Romans were teaching themselves and teaching their kids to look for things like misunderstandings and miscommunication.
So misunderstandings can cause issues on projects. Obviously, I mean, I'm just stating a fact. That's like stating that, it's like mom and apple pie of project management, right?
Right.
Miscommunication has the potential to create risks and issues in that. So, in your experience, how do you or have you taken on the active addressing of risks of miscommunication? Have you dealt with that in ways that's more formal or informal? How have you done it?
Um, Very formal. I take risk very seriously. Whether I have a 6-week project with indirect costs or whether I have a 3-year project with a $10 million budget. I look at risk and I say, here's how we're going to look at risk. And then I say, here's how we're going to measure impact. And here's how we're going to estimate probability. And here's our threshold, right? And below this threshold, we agree that we're not going to act on these risks. And above this threshold, we agree that we're going to have to address these risks proactively. Now, this sets me up for ongoing risk management. So I can tell myself and I can tell others, hey, just a couple weeks ago, we said there's a threshold and look at this high level risk. Why are we treating it as a lower level risk? What's the disconnect? What's the dissonance? And this is what allows us to actually find those misunderstandings, even with risks, even with things that aren't even here. They might happen in the future, but we're actually using this type of analysis and validation to clarify misunderstandings.
No, that's exactly how we should be going about doing um, sort of a risk mitigation of what can happen with miscommunication. And I think you inferred, although, or you implied, although I don't, maybe I inferred more than you implied, was that it has to be in writing. Even as I began this session with something in writing, it has to be in writing so that both parties can see it exactly laid out. And my favorite part of putting something in writing was that I or someone on my team was the writer, because that way, if there was any slanting, you could do it in your favor. Not that that's an illicit way of doing management, but sometimes when there's a disagreement or whatever, sometimes you do need that little extra advantage in yourself. But on as a second part of that, if someone else puts it in writing and I'm reading it and there's something that's a little bit off, I immediately go to correct the written record, because we need to have that common understanding to be able to move forward. So yes, there is a definite formality around the whole idea of risk management and miscommunication.
Yeah, it's both formal so it can be absolutely clear and it has to be written so that you have some record you can go back to and validate. That's exactly right.
We use on the project I'm working on right now, we use something called um, a RAID catalog or whatever. It's RAID, which stands for risk, action item, issue, and then the D is for decision. So we document decisions, for example, that come out of a situation where we come to an agreement. Because there's nothing worse than a month from now that someone says, "No, I thought we said this." No, 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 we said this. No, 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 I thought we said this. But if the decision is documented in writing, if the action items are documented in writing, if the risks and issues are documented in writing, it's much easier to go back to the written record formally so that we can maintain progress forward and not get caught up in misunderstandings and miscommunications.
That's a wonderful tool.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to review that one because I usually have my risks and my issues separate, but I can see where there's a lot of value in managing them as a cohesive picture because risks often, when they occur, they're often just going over to the issue column.
Yeah. And risks often spawn action items. And when a risk is mitigated, it often requires a decision that's documented. So all of that being in one place in different sections just makes managing the process a lot easier.
Wow, that's nice. Thank
Sure.
you for that. Now, um, so if you have misunderstandings, you're going to have conflict, and you have that whole bucket of tools and concepts to play on there. And again, you and I are very comfortable with thinking about miscommunications or communication and understanding how they don't just help you with consensus and what do I need to do to develop or maintain consensus, but also conflict itself. Do you see a lot of consensus as emerging after you've observed conflict, or do you see the problems in consensus and then do you observe the conflict? Which one comes first when you're looking at this?
I think it's all over the map from my experience, but if I have the ability to steer the conversation, I would rather begin with the consensus to avoid the conflict, because it makes, I mean, the one thing about conflict is, yes, it always gets resolved or most often gets resolved, but it takes time and energy and spirit to resolve it. But if I can do something up front to avoid it altogether, the harmony that is maintained as a result of that is much more easy to have collaboration on the project than all that contention when conflict arises.
Proactive activities and a proactive nature. Yeah, it simplifies and it gets rid of things. It minimizes risk even before they occur. That's beautiful.
If you think about it, resolving communication issues really follows the same kind of pattern that you can use for resolving conflict should conflict arise in a project. So number one is you don't ignore conflict. You don't ignore miscommunication. You try to straighten it out almost immediately. In conflict, you try to clarify what the issue is. In the miscommunication situation, you try to clarify what was truly meant and then document that. If you want to bring the involved parties together in one room to deal with conflict, you want to bring the parties all together in one room to deal with the miscommunication, and so on and on it goes. So I think conflict resolution and handling of miscommunication or avoiding miscommunication, whatever, are exactly the same kinds of processes.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you for that. So I think we're actually pretty good with this topic. What other items can you share with our listeners here in guiding them towards learning and starting to master consensus building and clarification of communication?
Well, we've talked a lot about miscommunication, but let me ask you a question, which I think may elaborate even a little more. Is that how do you go about finding errors in communications, or how do you go about finding misunderstanding? Is there a process?
Mm. Yeah, I have some mechanisms. Let's take it very simply. Okay. I'm really big with definitions. And I stress constantly, are we defining these concepts in the same way? And so when I find people with habits of using words in different ways than how we define them at the beginning of the project, I say, okay, there's a risk of miscommunication. Starting off with a real crystalline structure and then stepping back and observing deviation from that, and then stepping in before it becomes a major issue is one way of how I do it.
I
You,
like that.
yeah, it works really well. Um, Actually, one of my friends did this in a more elaborate manner. He would be managing 150 to 250 people in a battalion, moving maintenance shacks from one part of a country that the army was in to another part, right? And so he'd have to be managing communication from one group to another. And he'd have to be making sure that the directives he was putting out would be the same. So, what he would do, and he didn't do this in places that would impact the work, but what he would do is use certain terms and concepts and phrases with one group and certain terms and phrases and concepts with a different group. And then he could, observing how the people were talking and what concepts and phrases that people were using, he could plot mentally the communication channels that were happening that he was not observing.
Interesting. So then if miscommunication happened, he could possibly tie that back to his instruction because one instruction may have been more clear than the other.
Exactly. And also the channels that he wasn't observing, he could start taking advantage of. He'd
That's
say, okay, that the fuel people over here are really effective in working with the people putting the shacks up. But the guys over here with the oil changes are not having the same thing. What are they doing? Where are they talking? How are they sharing the information? And so he was using this elaborate, very mature approach to understanding how communication was working within the group to actually take advantage and minimize both the risks and the issues of miscommunication. Now, this wasn't him stepping in and saying, we're going to think like a group, we're going to agree on the direction. He was actually behind the scenes and looking at how people were naturally behaving and then influencing that behavior in a positive manner and de-emphasizing the behavior that was negative.
That is that's actually quite fascinating. It would take some work to understand how to formulate those two different kind of experimental processes, but that's fascinating.
Yeah, and
Was
his projects were 4 or 5 years long. So
Yeah,
he could afford to do that. He could ruminate over many, many weeks of dinners,
yeah.
in his tent and build these models and look at them. For us in these short projects, this is why we have these tools like these team charters, but we can still do the same data. You know, we can still look at the progress of the work. We can still look at the cohesiveness and health of the team and how mature the team is. And then with more less than 50 people, we can always look at how engaged the people are. Are they talking? Are they just standing talking with others, or are they out by themselves? And are they contributing to the work themselves? And those simple 3 metrics you can do just by walking through the work environment. And so it's this type of data gathering and analysis can become a very natural part of just the way you do the work.
And you know what I'm finding from this discussion? The question I asked was, how do you find errors in communication? And you and I both always come back to, we do everything we can to avoid errors in communication happening.
Yeah, yeah, you solve the problem before it occurs.
Yeah.
And again, as we go through these other conversations, that's what we do with everything. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that if there is an error in communication, and of course there are errors in communication on projects. Typically, I don't find them. Typically, they find me. Then I end up having to, then I end up having to react as opposed to be proactive in those situations. But you know what?
Exactly.
That's why we spend time becoming project managers and understanding the nuances of human behavior and all the human factors that go into the decisions and the conduct that we have on projects.
That's beautiful. And you know what? That hopefully that the issues that come up are the ones that would come up regardless of whether we were actively or proactively looking at them. And then we can actually sink our teeth into them.
You know,
Go ahead.
no, I was going to say the other part of this though, and maybe I should have asked the second question to that. Yes, you're going to have errors in terms of just plain old miscommunication. But here's another thing, and this happened to me just recently, is someone will give you an answer that is absolutely 100% correct, except it isn't complete. And so and the situation that happened was, and the person was asking for tax advice in a very specific situation. And one of our compatriots offered the tax advice, says, if this happens, do this. And what she offered was absolutely 100% correct. However, she left out 4 other situations that could contribute to the person's initial problem. And so by answering what she did, she began misleading or miscommunicating, even though she was 100% correct. She was miscommunicating with this person. So I, not being one to let something fester and sit there incorrectly, I said, yes, that's correct. However, let's add these situations and explore them to fulfill the complete picture. And immediately light bulbs are going on all over. Now they have the complete information as well as the correct information.
That's beautiful. You've actually combined 2 critical areas of management and project management. Complete is the scope and correct is the quality. And you did it very masterfully. I like that.
And it's one of those things where you watch for that miscommunication.
Yeah, and again, it can be correct, but not complete, and you're
Yeah.
not done. Oh boy. And I've had that too. I don't want to belabor this, but I've gone to vice presidents and say, do your organization need this? And the vice president says, no, that's not part of our job this year. And then have 2/3 of the workers saying, we need this 6 weeks later. And again, that's that whole issue of correct and complete as well. And this is troublesome. And we can't beat ourselves up for missing these things. What we can do is, correct them as we go, and then capture them as lessons learned and reference them in our future work.
Which kind of leads me to maybe our final kind of discussion point for this particular broadcast. And that is in terms of just looking at tools to avoid, what we just talked about, some quick and some valuable tools that we can share with our listeners, especially younger people who are trying to develop their own toolbox full of tricks. What are some of the things that you've found that help with consensus building and with clarifying communication issues and with all of the, coming up with a common understanding, all of the things that we've been talking about today? Any formal tools or any processes that you use?
Well, first of all, again, we can look at, you know, aggressive management through the use of things like the team charter and the risk register and issue log. We've heightened on that. I love your RAID template. I'm going to have to do some research on that. That's beautiful. That combines the risk register and issue log really well.
Yeah.
On top of that, it's just the formal, critical thinking. It's the analysis. It's the variance analysis. What did I think was going on and what is truly going on? And what's the difference? And how can I close that difference? And approaching this, and this is where we get to behavior. Okay. Not approaching this as finding the culprit, but actually approaching it with curiosity to say, can we actually, number one, solve this problem? And number two, can we solve it for all future projects? And keeping that mindset and behavior throughout the whole thing.
You just made me smile because I had a boss that used to use the phrase whenever we get into a contentious issue similar to this, he would say, all right, let's bring all the liars into the same room. Now, obviously, he wasn't labeling us all liars, but you've got your truth, you've got their truth, and you've got the consensus or the agreement or the real truth or something in the middle somewhere, and you have to come do that. So one of the things that I learned from that, I would not ever tell my team or my client that they were liars, and I would say, let's bring the involved parties into the same room and let's work this out before it becomes a problem.
Exactly. And that's the purpose. We started off by saying projects by nature are us versus them. And what you've highlighted is ensuring that you're constantly influencing, converting the us versus them to a we. And that's the true art of leadership.
One of the tricks or techniques that I've used on occasion is something I learned actually through an organization called Toastmasters. And it's the ability to do brainstorming, but in a round robin fashion. So brainstorming, typically we think, well, we'll just throw ideas at the whiteboard and see what sticks. So this is more formalized. It's brainstorming in terms of, number one, I jot down your idea on the whiteboard and make no judgment. I go to the next person and then the next person until every single person has had the ability to contribute to a line item on the whiteboard. And then I begin the round robin all over again until I exhaust all ideas. Then we look at the ideas and go through them in a formal fashion and say, okay, what here really sticks to help us understand the problem and how it is that we can mitigate it? And it's interesting. I may throw out something that makes sense to me. You may throw out something that makes sense to you. And I look at your idea and I go, oh, I never thought of that. And suddenly the consensus builds. But it's brainstorming with round robin. And if you really want to make it even better, bring in an independent facilitator.
Yes. So you must have been sitting in my class today. This
I
is the
wish.
second time. This is the second time that you're saying about something that I highlighted as a very important topic. Brainstorming. If you look at the definition, it has nothing to do with analysis. It has to
Right.
do with we are collecting information, and you use a certain part of your brain right here and here to do that. Now, the analysis, use a different part of the brain to do the analysis, and it takes a whole different set of tools, and it takes a whole different facilitation technique. And so if you're doing them at the same time, it can get complicated and confusing. But if you do it in a formal way, it's more thorough and you get to a better result.
Well, and the beautiful part about brainstorming, if done well, done correctly, I don't, no, maybe I should say done well, is that no person is judged for their
Yes.
contribution.
Yes.
And secondly, if your contribution happens to have a line through it, it doesn't mean it wasn't valid. It just means that in the total look at this particular problem, the ones that stayed on the boards are the ones that are better equipped to handle the situation. So as long as we can maintain the person's dignity and their integrity intact, then we have a solution that truly works and comes to consensus.
And that's what consensus is. Consensus says your idea has value, therefore you have value. We're capturing it. And at the same time, we need this value on the project. We need you to support the group. So we started off with consensus, and now we're ending up with that whole statement of the value of consensus with the shared understanding. Brilliant. Brilliant.
On our last broadcast, I ended with, I can't wait to hear what we're going to say next time. Actually, I kind of liked what we said this time. I think it just makes a whole lot of sense. So
Yeah,
thank you for
it was another verse of leadership, but it rhymed really well with what we were saying 2 weeks ago.
yeah. And so on that note, I can't wait to hear what we're going to say next week.
I can't wait either. So thanks again. Where can we find you if we want to reach out to you throughout this next week?
These days, it's just as easy to find me on LinkedIn as anywhere, just because I like to, every day I explore my LinkedIn and see what contributions have been made and see, I've had several people, I think maybe as a result of these broadcasts, link in with me. So that's a great thing. So as long as we can collaborate with people who are learning and people who can teach us, LinkedIn is my tool and my place of reference.
Great. It's a very powerful tool and allows us to have these long-term ongoing conversations outside of YouTube and outside of other media.
Well, great. So I guess next week for another scintillating discussion on a project management technique. If there's anybody out there who would love to contribute by adding comments or maybe even becoming a guest on our podcast, that would be great. We would love that as well. So,
that would be a treat. Thanks again,
Wonderful.
Merv, and we'll continue our conversation
next time.
Thanks again.